Just take a moment in prayer and just focus in on Jesus before we dive into his word. Jesus, all of us struggle at times to align our minds and hearts with who you are and where you want us to go. And this is an opportunity for us to realign our minds and hearts with the truth that you've given us. And so we're asking you to speak into us and to transform us from the inside out and to make us new in the way that we think, in the way that we act, in the way that we live, so that you shine through us in amazing ways. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, if you were here last week, you will remember that we started last week, we started a new series called Chazown. And if you weren't here, well, you missed out. But I know that there's lots of family events going on. We had a big event yesterday at our house where Peggy's side of the family came over for Christmas, so we're still Christmasing and parties and those types of things. For those of you who were here last week, this will be a review. For those of you who weren't here, we'll kind of catch you up with where we're at. So the word Chazown, and it's a Hebrew word. The CH in the Hebrew sounds like a gargly H, so it's Chazown. A Chazown is a vision, a dream, a prophecy, or a revelation from God. And that word comes up in the scriptures here and there. And last week, we watched Samuel as a young man, young boy, get his Chazown from God while he was asleep right in the tabernacle. God wakes him up and gives him a message. But we're not really going to focus in on Samuel. I wanted to give people an example of what it looked like, or a possible way that God sometimes speaks to us. We're going to really focus in on Nehemiah and the vision of what God wanted him to do. So you can start flipping your way to Nehemiah if you like. And while you do, the word Chazown is used in this verse, and this is kind of our theme verse for the whole series. Where there is no revelation, people cast off restraint, but blessed is the one who heeds wisdom's instruction. And the word revelation there comes from Chazown. Where there is no Chazown, where God doesn't have a mission for your life, people cast off restraint. In other words, they just kind of wander through life, kind of go their own direction, which obviously is not great. So when I was a teenager, there was this guy who was named Zig Ziglar. Does anybody remember Zig Ziglar? We got a few. Yeah, all right. So Zig Ziglar was one of those guys who was popular because, well, the guy had way too much caffeine. He was just all go. And he started out as a salesman, and then I believe he wrote a book, and then he became a motivational speaker. And so these corporations would hire him to come and speak to their corporation, all their people, and he would get them all pumped up and excited. And he was one of those people that had all kinds of quotable quotes, right? Where he would say something in just a very succinct, clear way. And you've maybe heard this particular statement. He says, "If you aim at nothing, you will hit it every time." Anybody heard that little quote? Yeah. All right. And as I've watched people who don't have a central theme for their life and a direction, yeah, they hit nothing every time. They just kind of wander through life, and there's no motivation, there's no direction, and whatever they come across, just wherever life leads them is where they end up going because they've got no sense of purpose and no direction. And what I have found is that if I don't consistently come back and say, what is God's vision for my life? If I don't ask that question again and again, I begin to wander. And there's no sense of direction. And so I need to keep going back to my compass of God's direction for my life and ask myself again and again, where does God want to take me and how do I align my life with Him? So either we're going to drift through life or we're going to have this sense of direction that is set on a purpose that is eternal and dynamic. And I think about like some of the Bible characters. Moses spent the first 80 years shepherding sheep, and there's nothing wrong with shepherding sheep. But then this one day, he finds a bush that doesn't burn up. It just burns and burns and burns. And he stands in front of this bush. And the God of the universe says, I hear my people. They're calling out for someone to deliver them. And guess what? I'm giving you a Chazown. Go back to Israel, or go back to Egypt and get my people out. And then there's Esther, and this was a completely different way of running into your Chazown. So Esther is this beautiful young lady who's smart, and the king says, "Ooh, be my queen." So he marries her. And then, through a series of events, she ends up saving the people of Israel by advocating for them in front of the king. And if you'll remember, her uncle says to her, it could be just for this one reason that God has put you in this position. And so she didn't really find her Chazown until there was this situation that happened. Or it could be a little bit like David, where David's out shepherding sheep. And Samuel comes along and calls him and his brothers together and anoints David as king. And it's like, surprise, right? Where someone else helped him find his Chazown. Or Mary, like we just got done with Christmas. Mary is just doing life. She has her whole life ahead of her. She's going to get married. Life is going to be great. And an angel shows up and says, guess what? God has a job for you. And it affects her whole life, right? So there's different ways that this happens. Now, we're not focused on any of those Bible characters. Like I said, we're going to Nehemiah, and we'll start at verse 1 here in just a minute. And let me just say that I think we can kind of just go through life and wander around, or we can come to God and we can say, God, I really want to align my life with you. I really want to live with a purpose. Talk to me about my Chazown. And it may be a process. It may not happen just overnight. But we can live in the Chazown zone for our whole lives. And so asking God for a specific calling of where He wants to take us, I think, is essential. So I want to encourage you over these next few weeks to really consider sitting down with God and going like, okay, what is the real purpose you created me? How did you design me to make a difference in the world? Okay, so we're going to read it again, like I said, in just a minute. But I do want to set the scene. I want you to have a kind of a vision of the situation we're walking into. So we have Nehemiah. He's an Israelite, and he's living in Elam in the Susa region. And so you can see the map there. The yellow circle there is the Susa region where he's living. And then the red arrow kind of shows you where Israel is. And here's what happened was about 600 years before Christ, the Israelites had been conquered and taken captive, and the majority of them had been dragged off to the Babylonians, and they had lived as slaves in Babylonia. And now, this is 150 years after that event. Think about that, 150 years of living in Babylon as a Jew because you were forced to. And so it's been 150 years where they've been stuck there. And now we have Nehemiah, but Nehemiah is not your average slave. So it's a little unclear as to whether a lot of the Israelites had kind of worked their way out of slavery and were just living there, or what this really looked like. But Nehemiah is head of the Secret Service. Now, think about that. You go in 150 years, which is a long time, you go from slave to head of the Secret Service. And here's why this is really strange. So, kings were extremely paranoid. And here's why. They weren't elected. It's not like there's this process of election where you get elected, and because you were elected, you're there for 4 years or 10 years or your lifetime. It's like survival of the fittest, and whoever is strongest and most influential gets to be king. And if I can take you out, then maybe I have a chance at being king. So if I murder you or assassinate you, I have a chance at being king next. So that would make you paranoid, right? Because the people closest to you have the highest potential for taking you out. And yet, this king chooses to make a Jewish person who had been taken captive the head of his security system. And so Nehemiah has this awesome job. I mean, he's living in the palace with the king, with all the benefits, and you can imagine that this is a pretty decent job with a great benefit plan, and your family is well taken care of, good education, good health care. All those things are really looking good. And so Nehemiah is there, head of the Secret Service, watching over the king, and you want someone who's absolutely dedicated, who's really smart, right? And can anticipate what other people might do. And you want someone who's going to ferociously protect you. Someone who will... So one of the key fears was that you would be poisoned. And so guess who gets to sample the food first? You get great food, as long as there's not something in it that's designed to kill the king, right? And so Nehemiah is that guy. Okay, so now, Nehemiah, chapter 1, starting at verse 1. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. Okay, so that kind of gives us a background of what's happening. Nehemiah had lived all of his life in Elam, and there was a part of him that was still passionate about the historical city of Jerusalem and of Israel, his country. And so he's like, his brother travels, this is like 900 miles, travels back to see how the old world is and how things are going there. And so he's asking, how are things back home? And then verse 3, it says, they said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and the gates have been burned with fire. In other words, yeah, life back at the home country, it stinks. It is not good. And here's why. It's been 150 years, and no one has rebuilt the wall to protect the city. and there's no gates on the wall. So any group of raiders who come riding through can come through and just tear up the place because they have no sense of protection at all. And so these people are actually living in poverty. This is a worst case scenario. They are in helplessness, and there's a sense of disgrace about this too. Because they are helpless, what they're saying about their God is helpless to help them. So this isn't just an economic problem. This is a statement about Yahweh. And the statement is, he's a nobody. All right, so now we're at verse 4. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you today, this day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, the decrees, and the laws that you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the furthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling place for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king. You know, Nehemiah hears this report from his brother, and his reaction is to cry and call out to God in desperation, because this problem, it just brings him agony. I don't think he was faking this. I don't think he was conjuring this up. I think it just broke his heart to think that not only was this city broken down, but that God was being represented in this way. And I think back to the various Bible stories where someone received a Chazown. You know, like we said, Moses received his Chazown through a fiery bush. Isaiah received his Chazown by eating a scroll. Mary received her Chazown from an angel. But Nehemiah doesn't really get a message from God. He gets a message from his brother. And it breaks his heart. And so he starts coming in front of God, going, God, what is it you want to do? The reason I bring this up is because I want people to understand there's no magic certain way that you're going to get a Chazown. It can come through a wide variety of ways. But what we do have to do is we have to be looking and waiting for God to speak to us. A while back, I read a book by Mark Batterson. It was called The Wild Goose Chase. And his statement was that ancient Christians used to say that following the Holy Spirit is like a wild goose chase. When you really try to follow the Spirit, you never know when he's going to cut left or cut right, and you have to be ready to follow in any direction that he goes. But he said, here's one thing that can help guide you to follow the Spirit. And he said, ask this question. What makes you cry and pound your fist on the table and say, this is not right? because it's the thing that bothers us, where God is speaking to us and saying, I want you to do something about this. I'm putting that passion inside of you. So are there things in your life that makes you pound your fist on the table and scream at God and say, and tell him, God, do something? Because oftentimes, that is God's way of telling you to do something. You know, there's just different things that come up in Peggy and my life. And Peggy and I had the opportunity to go to Haiti when I was still in seminary. The church I was volunteering at took the youth group to Haiti. And we don't hear a lot about Haiti right now, but Haiti is still this place where life is miserable. When we were there, people were excited about eating once a day. It was a good day when you had a meal that day. And here's how it kind of worked. It was 80% unemployment at that time. And if I had a job that day, if I found somewhere that would employ me in some way, I would get paid that day, and I would go home and buy as much food as I could, and I would feed the neighborhood. And the reason was that I might not have a job tomorrow, and my friend Joe might have a job and feed the neighborhood tomorrow. And that's how they survived. Every day they got paid, they would go and buy as much food and feed as many people as they could so that all of them could eat. And that, I remember landing in Haiti, and there was a missionary bus that picked us up, and driving through on the roads, I was thinking to myself, we have fallen off the earth and we have landed somewhere in some foreign world because this is weird. Just how run down everything was and how desperate everybody looked. And so when Compassion International put out an opportunity for us to pick up a child in Haiti and pay for that child's education and food, Peggy and I jumped on it. You see, that's our second child. Our first child graduated through the process, and his name was Williams, and he's grown up, he's an adult, he's got a job now. And this is Michael, and Peggy and I can't change the future of every child in Haiti, but we can pick up one. And one of the reasons that we did that was seeing what they were going through just made us cry and pound our fist on the table, because no child should starve and struggle. I mean, if my children are going through that, as a parent, what wouldn't you do to try to feed them, right? And so if everyone was to think that way, how many lives would we change if we just saw some way of making a difference? Well, Nehemiah has a much different situation. He hears about the terrible situation for the Israelites because they're starving. They're struggling. And he isn't blaming God. He's not yelling at God. He's asking for God's favor because God has planted it somehow in his heart that Nehemiah is the one to go change what's going on there. Now, did you notice that in Nehemiah's prayer, there was this kind of organization of how he goes step by step? So let's look at Nehemiah's prayer. First of all, he submits to God, and he goes like, okay, God, I'm submitting to you. I'm putting you as leader of my life. I'm going to let you guide me. And that's in verse 5. Then in verse 6, he asks for favor. He says, okay, God, grant me this sense of favor as I pursue this, as I try to find a way to follow you. And then he goes into a confession of sin. He goes like, you know what? We have failed to follow you in so many ways, including me and my family. There's so many times when we don't do this right. And he takes a serious look at how he's living opposite of how God wants him to live. And then he says, but you, God, you have promised that if we do align with you, if we do make and put you first, that you will come through and that you will deliver and that you will bless us. And then that last section, he asks for God's leadership and again asks for God to guide him and make him successful. Now, I also noticed that in verse 4, Nehemiah claims that he prayed for, quote, some time. This was not a one-time prayer. This wasn't that, he, in 1 or 2 days, he did this prayer and then everything fell into place. He's in prayer and fasting for a significant amount of time. And he's really asking God to direct him. And sometimes we as Americans, we are just do it kind of people where we're going to get this done and, God, fix this in a day. And God oftentimes works slowly and methodically, and it takes time. And we get really impatient. When in fact, what he wants us to do is to sit in front of him and submit to him and let him take the leadership and for us to follow instead of running out ahead of him and doing things before he's set things up and organized things. And so he prays for some time in fasting and in prayer. And so just overall, here's what I want to remind you, that if this is something that you want to do in your life, you cannot run ahead of God and set your own Chazown. You have to let God set the Chazown. And you have to let him do it in his timing and in his way. And you have to keep coming back until that Chazown becomes clear and becomes solidified in exactly what he wants to do in your life. And here's what sometimes happens is, this happens in churches where people might be having a problem in their life. And so what we do is we automatically say, oh, there's a problem, I'm supposed to fix it. And so we run out and we hurry up and fix it for this other person. And God goes like, no. I just had that person set up to get serious. I just destroyed all their false idols. I just attacked everything that was keeping them from me. And you run in and fix it for them instead of letting me set the agenda of what they have to go through. It's not that we're supposed to fix everything that comes along. It's that we're supposed to let God tell us where we're supposed to go and how we're supposed to do it. Because the Chazown that God gives us is different for each one of us. And how he leads us into it is different for each one of us. And if he's stretching someone, sometimes we need to sit on the sidelines and let God stretch them so that they get serious. Okay. To summarize it, don't jump into just any Chazown that comes along. Make sure that God is calling you into this. And Nehemiah, along the way of this prayer and fasting and talking with God, becomes absolutely convinced that God is calling him to do something. and that he's supposed to step up. And I keep coming back to the fact that Nehemiah is an important man. He doesn't have just any job. This is a big deal. He has a good job. He has an awesome job. And he's in the highest levels of government. And it could have been that his Chazown was to transform the Babylonian government. Like, who knows, right? He had great perks, great financial package, house by the lake, kids got a great education, probably had a Maserati C20. And it doesn't get better than this, right? And here's what he's risking. He's risking offending this king because he's going to ask for something really big. It could be that not only does the king say no, that the king says, you're out of here. And he loses everything. And so I have a warning. You have to leave the safety zone to enter the Chazown zone. Following God into his vision is never safe. It just isn't. You may have heard someone say, there is no safer place than the center of God's will. They lied. I don't know of any more dangerous place. And here's why. God is not afraid of anything. He has a big vision. And he will take people into all kinds of risky situations because he's God. And sometimes we have to pay big sacrifices in order to go. And it's painful and it's ugly. And not only is it painful for us, sometimes it's painful for our loved ones too, right? And when you think of all the problems that people had to go through when they followed God, just think of this. Moses ran away from Egypt. Why? He was wanted for murder. God says, oh, by the way, I want you to go back to Pharaoh and go face to face with him. I'm wanted for murder, right? David is supposed to do hand-to-hand combat with a giant. Tell me that that's safe. Isaiah has to preach naked. That's not safe. Daniel has to sit in a lion's den. And Mary, she has to get pregnant and risk her marriage and risk her whole life because God is calling her to do something that most people just disapprove of, right? And so if you're trying to tell me that being in the center of God's will is safe, I'm not buying it. I think it's risky. And so we have to step out of that safe zone to go into the Chazown, and we have to be prepared to do what God wants and not what feels safe to us. And so Nehemiah has this position as cupbearer to the king. He's head of security, and now he's been preparing and praying and fasting and connecting with God, and so he's going to give up his position of leadership and the security that comes with it. But think of anybody better than him to create a security system for a city, right? This guy knows security. It's almost like God had been preparing him all of his life for this job, right? Isn't it interesting how when you look back at life and where God has you now, you can look back and you go like, oh, yeah, that happened in the past, and I bet he was setting me up for this. I bet he was creating these situations so that I would know how to handle this. And it's like God is preparing you for your Chazown. And I think back now, and here's what we're talking about as a church. Over the last month or so, we've been talking about where's God taking this church? What is the Chazown for our church, right? Well, it just so happens that I've planted 2 churches, and I've taken churches from literally 0, there's nobody, to 170 people. Well, that kind of fits in with the whole thought of we want to grow this church and connect with our community and help them grow. And as an interim pastor at the first church that we planted, we had a church split where people attacked me and undermined me. And I'll tell you that as an interim pastor, I go to certain churches where the reason that the pastor left was things were not going well, right? And so I happen to kind of had a similar experience to that, and God maybe has been preparing me for that. And so when we look back at what God has been preparing us for and what he's doing in the future, what we find is that a lot of times God has been working for years, prepping us for where he wants to take us. And so we can kind of go back and when I was a kid, lived on a farm, and we would put up fence. And the way in order to have a straight fence, what you do is you stand back and you line up the posts, and then the person down the road, you go like, put the post, move it a little bit, yeah, let's put it there, and then the post goes down in that spot. But you line up the fence posts to get the next fence post straight, right? And when you start looking at the fence posts of your life, you go like, oh, look at that. They all kind of line up. And you find out that God was taking your life that direction. And so looking at your past and the experiences that God's put you through sometimes help you see the future of where he wants to take you. This church has had an incredible history where ministry and outreach have done amazing things. And over the next few months, the elders are going to be looking at, like, where's God taking us? What's next for us? Because God's not finished. He wants to create a vision inside of us that centers us in a direction he wants us to go. And I encourage you to be in prayer for us as elders and for us as a whole church of, God, where do you want to go? What do you want to do next? How can we live with a sense of vision and direction and passion where we are moved to make a difference in other people's lives? And not only as a church, how do we do that, but how does each and every single person here fit into that? And what vision does God have for each person in our church? And so I'll give you just a minute to pray and prepare for that. And we're going to go into communion here too, where we're going to celebrate what Jesus has done and to enjoy the love and the grace that he's offered us. And he calls us to make a difference, to first of all enjoy this gift of salvation, but also to share this gift of salvation. And so as you spend time connecting with him, talk to him, and first of all, thank him for the goodness of his gift, and talk to him about how we can share that with others. So use this minute to prepare as we prepare for communion.